Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Tonight's panel is How to Unite, Ignite, and Get It Right, Writing About Social Justice. And our panelists tonight are, to my left, Vevey Griffith. She's the former director of Free Minds in Austin, Texas, a program that offers free college credits in the humanities to low-income students. Griffith built it from a pilot project to an established part of Austin's educational landscape and oversaw its move from the University of Texas to Foundation Communities. And I can say, as somebody who taught writing with Free Minds, if you can find out about the program and support it, it's really a terrific program. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Sun, Oxford American, Gettysburg Review, as well as online at Roll Reboot and in Edible Austin. She's the author of the poetry chapbook Weeks in This Country. She has taught community poetry workshops to children and adults, co-edited a literary magazine, and judged numerous writing contests. For 2 years, she served as a volunteer writing mentor in the Veterans Writing Project. Working with veterans and active servicemen and women, she teaches poetry and creative nonfiction at Austin Community College. Please welcome Vivé Griffith. Next is Nan Cuba. She is the author of Body and Bread, winner of the PEN Southwest Award in Fiction and the Texas Institute of Letters Stephen Turner Award for Best Work of First Fiction. She's also the co-editor of Art at Our Doorstep, San Antonio Writers and Artists. Her work has appeared in Antioch Review, Harvard Review, Columbia, Chicago Tribune's Printers Row, Life, Third Coast, and D Magazine. She has received Adobe Paisano Fellowship, an artist residency at Fundación Valparaiso in Spain, and was a finalist for the Humanities Texas Award for Individual Achievement. She's the founder and executive director emeritus of Gemini Inc., a nonprofit literary center in San Antonio, and she teaches at the MA/MFA program in Literature, Creative Writing, and Social Justice at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, where she is the writer in residence. Please welcome Nan Cuba.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Alejandro Puyana grew up in Caracas, Venezuela, but lives in Austin, Texas. His work has been published by the Tin House blog, The Toast, Huizache, and adapted for radio by NPR's The Texas Standard. He makes a living as a political writer for progressive causes, focusing on the Hispanic electorate. He worked as part of the Hillary for American Media team in 2016. Please welcome Alejandro. So I want to start with sort of the third of the bit of the title, which is Get It Right. And so if we're writing about social justice issues, the thing that often compels us to write about these things, and this is something that a lot of us are thinking about right now, is we see things and we want so badly to say things that make a difference. But then what happens when you go to write those things down is you realize there's a big gap between wanting and feeling that you can say something and having something to say and having the authority and the sort of like the experience and knowledge to say it. And so I wonder, might start with, what is required to get details right? I mean, to write about, pick your social justice issue. How can we get details right? What sort of research have you done in the past? How have you started to sort of educate yourself on a particular issue or generally in order to write an op-ed, a novel, an essay, a short story? Or can you simply sort of write from the gut, so to speak? Vevey, since you're sitting to my left, I'll start with you.
So I have a lot of thoughts about that, and I think the first thought that I have is that when we're thinking about writing for social justice, I think that we can get very, very involved in things that we feel passionately about, that we get excited about, and sort of forget about figuring out maybe first where our biggest strengths and expertise are. So before we say, I'm going to go write about Obamacare, or I'm going to go write about the border wall, we might begin by saying, what do I already know? What do I already bring to the table? What have I experienced through my own life, my own education, my own work life, the people in my life, and sort of beginning at a place of bringing to the conversation what you already have before you start reaching out for things that maybe you feel passionately about, but maybe at least immediately have less to offer in that way. And I have found that that's been important for me. And to do a really good inventory, I know that I know about working with adult students who don't have college degrees and are living on low incomes, but as I started looking at what I know about the kinds of barriers, financial barriers that students face in general. I know about running a small program. I know about fundraising. I know about all these different things that then can contribute to the conversation apart from just that simple thing. So I think the first thing, it doesn't answer the question of details, but the first thing I think is really getting clear on what you have to offer to the conversation already, and then you can go sort of beyond that. So, starting place.
You know, Nan, so you've worked, I think, primarily in fiction, and one of the things that you hear in a lot of fiction classes is write what you know. But there's also a lot that we don't know. And so I wonder how far, like, what you know can take you in a work of fiction, and at what point do you realize, like, if I'm going to write this, I have to sort of get beyond my own experience and background and knowledge and into somebody else's.
Okay, so is this in reference to a social justice issue or anything that you're trying to
I mean, it really could be
use
generally as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things I want to say first. I'm going to talk about fiction, so that's the context of my remarks tonight. I've published in other areas, but I'm primarily a fiction writer. First thing I wanted to say was J.M. Coetzee, who was a South African author, Nobel Prize winner, said once in a lecture, and he actually wrote about the effects of apartheid, but he said in a lecture that telling novelists that they need to be writing about social issues is like colonizing them. Mm-hmm. And he was very resistant to the idea about feeling that as a mandate. So that's the first thing I want to say, is that I teach in a program where our focus is social justice, but at the same time we tell our students, you can write about whatever you need to be writing about. Don't feel like you're being forced to fit into some kind of mold. And related to that is this. I write literary fiction. Literary fiction, the short definition is that its goal is to reflect aspects of the human experience. So the emphasis is on characterization. If that's what you're trying to do, you're going to be revealing something about social issues. It's going to come naturally. And that's the key word for me. Another thing that I tell my students is, I think all artists actually have passionate beliefs. I think that's one reason, and I mean artists of every form, every discipline. I think that's what brings us to want to create art. The tricky part is, if you start with an idea and then you try to shape a piece of fiction around it, it feels artificial and manipulated. Instead, actually the comparison I give my students is, it's like a scientist going into a lab and saying, I'm going to create a lab experiment that will prove what I want it to prove, right? Instead, you go into your story, you go into the lab, and you hope for a discovery. I think writing is a process of discovery. So, now about research. Research, I find, is necessary. I do a lot of it. The tricky part is not to get obsessed about it.
Alejandro, sort of to send this question over to you in a similar way, you have a story in the most recent issue of Versace, Viernes Santo, which is about a baseball player in Venezuela, and he's sort of struggling with the decision to come to the United States to play pro ball. And I believe your novel is set in Venezuela as well. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think we assume, probably wrongly, is that when writers are writing about a country that they're from that's not the United States, that they just they have this body of knowledge that they just draw upon, and they wrote it, and it's real because they wrote it. And oftentimes we get into questions of authenticity. Well, they're from there, and so they know it. And I wonder how much research you've had to do either for that story or for the novel, and how have you gone about that? How have you sort of like, as Vevey was saying, sort of like identified the things that you know and identified the things that you don't know?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of work involved behind that. It's not something that comes natural, especially for somebody like me. I grew up in Venezuela, but I'm certainly not a person that struggled. I had a very privileged life in Venezuela, and the privilege to come to the United States without much obstacle. So I've been pretty lucky in that regard. But you do have an experience of living in a country that is very different from the United States, and where you see struggle every day, you read about it every day on the news, and you are intimately connected in some sort of way with it. In my case, my family has had many experiences with violence, with from anywhere from muggings to kidnappings, and that has made at least me want to explore that in a deeper way. And the way that I've gone about it was to think about the humanity of those that are not like me. Visiting criminals, talking to them, talking to the people that, kidnapped my brother, for example, and trying to figure out why they've done what they've done. And because if there's something that we all know is that each one of us is human, we share in this humanity. So digging into that humanity, and that's something that I do in my fiction. I try to figure out what is human about each of the characters, be they good or bad. Everyone shares that. So
Remember the one that you wrote about? There was one that you referenced kidnapping, and you begin into like imagine like why the kidnappers might have done what they did, so you can begin to think about the humanity, but there's also like I would imagine like certain things that make that difficult. One is their background's different than yours, and also like you have a personal stake in this. It was like your brother. It wasn't just some like random person who got kidnapped. Well, how do you approach getting inside their heads?
Well, the way that I approached that particular essay, which meant a lot to me because in this particular case, my brother was very close to death, basically by the hand of others, was that when I thought about it, and it wasn't only me, it was me and my brother in conversation when we thought about what had happened, it was that these kids that had kidnapped him weren't much different that we were. I mean, if we would have been born to their same circumstances, that kidnapping somebody for ransom would have been a perfectly logical thing to do. When you are oppressed to such an extent where your family doesn't have money for food, literally. I mean, there are people making lines in Venezuela right now so they can, lines for 5 hours so they can buy a kilo of pasta or a kilo of sugar or flour. People do extreme things, and that's natural, that's human behavior. So in my conversation, in that case, in my conversation with my brother, we quickly realized that we weren't much different than the people that had done this.
Nan, in your novels, like kind of the same question, like what sort of like exercises, sort of mental or writing have you had to do to kind of get inside the head of characters who don't share your background, or who maybe even in fact like sort of believe things you don't believe, or who would like make choices that you would not make?
I think it's a similar question is how do you take what others would call an unlikable character and make this a person that the reader would enjoy following and hearing about. A sympathetic character, I guess. I think there needs to be a point of reference that the reader can identify with. Something, some vulnerability, something about a habit, something about a presence, a value, I don't know. In the novel I'm working on now, there is a man who is confessing to a lot of crimes. He's a serial killer. And when I try to think about that with this character, because it's multiple points of view, so there are times when I'm inside of his mind, what I come up with is he is trying everything he can do to find ways to control his environment. We all don't, we hate being out of control. He also wants any way that he can feel as though he's gaining some respect. We all need that, right? So there are ways for the reader to identify with him, even though he is what you would think of as a totally unlikable character. Does that answer your question?
Vevey, you've written poetry, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But in op-eds, one of the things that I would imagine you might have to think about is like the perspective that you bring to the op-ed. So, for instance, the one that you wrote about sort of student debt and tuition, like you were coming to that from like a director of a program that was dealing with like students getting college credit. Right. But you were writing about, you know, a student who was going through some problems with student debt. And like, how do you have to sort of think about like sort of the, like your experience versus like her experience and how it might look differently to her than it does to you?
Yeah, it was really important to me with that story. I mean, I had the advantage, and a lot of the sort of social justice related writing I've done have been around students that I've worked with who I have the opportunity to get to know well, and that was the case there. And it was important to me, even in a short op-ed format where you have, you know, 600 or 800 words to try to say everything that you want to say, that that this student didn't come across as just somebody who had struggled in school and ended up with debt that she couldn't pay off, because that's only a very small part of who she is in the world. And apart from even just knowing her and having had her in class for 9 months, you know, I went out and interviewed her, spent 2 hours having breakfast with her, and heard about her family and heard about her life. And it's hard to know how much of that comes through, but it was really important. It's always important, I think, in writing this way, that you're not, as the writer, separate, you know. And Alejandro was talking about the humanity and all of us in our shared humanity, and I think you can fall very dangerously into a trap that you're trying to somehow explain somebody else's life, and I think that that's really very dangerous. And it was also important to me in that story that the student herself was comfortable with everything that was written, that I ran it by her, I ran the edits by her before it was finally published, and was in communication with her, because she put a lot on the line to have her story told, to try to change what happened for other students. And that was really where she sat, was like, I don't want what happened to me to happen for other students, but it made her very vulnerable. And, you know, when you're writing op-eds and you're writing in public forums, we all know the kind of responses that happen out there. And, you know, I had to warn her, as I was warned, don't read the comments, step away from all of that. But she's the one that really was coming under fire. And so it's important that she was represented in a way that showed her dignity and her as a full person, and that she was 100% comfortable with it. I wasn't in any way trying to own or use her story in a way that wasn't respectful. So,
Nan, to go back to something that you said earlier, you said that when you think about a work of fiction, you don't start with an idea or some sort of like message. You start with like characters and story, and then those things sort of rise organically up out of them. And one of the things you'll hear in like writing workshops is that if you start with the idea and the theory, then it becomes didactic.
Yes.
Like it becomes a story that's designed to sort of like convey a message. Right. And this might sound like sort of an obvious question, but why is that bad? Why is didacticism bad in fiction?
Well, I think it's like like other questions a writer would come up with, it's a choice you make. Maybe a writer does want to write didactic fiction. That's fine with me. I've made my choice. That's not what I want to do. What I'm aiming for is literary fiction, which means my audience is about 10 people. But yeah, so it's not necessarily bad. It's a choice that I have made. So I don't aim for didactic fiction, and what I aim for instead is to reflect the human experience, which means that individuals are portrayed in their complexity. They're not one-dimensional. None of them, even the secondary characters, have some complexity so that they seem authentic in a world that could be believable.
You know, you're hardly the only person to sort of think that like didactic fiction doesn't work. There's a great essay by James Baldwin, who's in the news a lot lately because of the new film. He's got an essay called Everybody's Favorite Protest Novel, and it begins like this. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very bad novel, having in its self-righteous, virtuous sentimentality much in common with Little Women. Sentimentality, the ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion, is the mark of dishonesty. The inability to feel, the wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart, and it is always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent fear of life. The signal of secret and violent inhumanity, the mask of cruelty. He sort of pulls no punches in that particular essay. And I wonder about that, about his phrase, like about sentimentality and about excessive and spurious emotion. What are the risks that writers sort of wade into if emotion becomes, I mean, if it's sentimental, then I suppose it means it's like in some way unearned. Why does that not work? And like, what is it perhaps like trying to make up for, like when writers sort of fall to that?
Well, I think that the key word in that passage is dishonesty. To me, when I read something that reads sentimental or has sentimentality, it just reads as fake. It's not true. And especially in fiction, even though it's fiction, I mean, what you're aiming for is to tell the truth or to read the truth from fake characters. And when something doesn't ring true, then it becomes sentimentality. I think it's, like you said, it's a non-earned emotion.
Can I jump in
Yeah.
here? I think the key is to, when that happens, when the reader is reading a scene and suddenly the character is highly emotional and the reader is not responding and it feels like a faked emotion, it's because the character has not been developed enough. If the character is developed enough, then when we get to that moment, it's not like those moments shouldn't be there. It's that when we get there, we also have lived vicariously through that character and we understand when it happens because we remember something that might be similar and we then can respond. I also want to put a teacher hat on. Can I do that? Will you all forgive me if I put a teacher hat on?
Put it on.
Oh, there is a wonderful collection of essays called The Unknown World by Robert Boswell. And in it, he has an essay called Politics and Art in the Novel. And I highly recommend that you look at it. And I'm going to boil down some of his suggestions for those of you who are interested in this. He says that writers have 3 responsibilities. The first is to speak the truth and expose lies. He says this is accomplished by telling both sides of an issue. So instead of going in with only your idea, remember writing should be a process of discovery. So you have to show both sides of the issue and you have to acknowledge the full range of all the possibilities. The second is to ask the reader to change how she sees her culture. Don't reiterate or embody an existing ideology. He thinks you should invent some new way to see it. And the third is set events in a historical perspective. That way the writing continues telling a truth and contributes to the issue's history.
Vevey, I wonder if all of that holds true for like op-eds and essays that appear in like newspapers and magazines, especially the idea of like exploring both sides, because very often in an op-ed you have a point that you're trying to convey, even if that point is just like we should pay attention to this thing. Do you explore both sides, or what's your approach?
I think it's essential to explore both sides. Otherwise, you're just in this sort of sounding chamber and speaking only to the people who agree with you to begin with. And I think you can't construct a really effective argument. So an op-ed really should begin with what outcome do you want to see. So an op-ed is not a ruminative, here are all the things that are wrong kind of thing. It's really about here's how things should be, here's why, and a key part of it is sort of what they often call as the to be sure. You have to acknowledge that there's another side to the argument, because that's how you can actually change people's minds. And so I think that that's where an op-ed is very different, and where I think when we get very passionate about writing about social justice, we want to just sort of go in and say everything. And I think what we really are called to do is to make measured arguments that speak to people, and to render experience on the page that help people feel and understand. But we can't do it when we're only addressing one side of the story. Sure.
I was at, last week, and I was at AWP, the AWP conference. It's the Association of Writers and Writers Programs in DC. And I moderated a panel that included the writer LaShonda Catrice Barnett, whose novel Jam on the Vine starts out in Jim Crow era Texas. And we talked about this scene that she wrote in which one of her characters encounters the police. This being Jim Crow era Texas, it proceeds in a way that we can kind of expect and anticipate. And then at the end of that scene, the character Ennis does this thing that is shocking and totally unexpected. And LaShonda talked about in that scene how important it was to give her character the chance to behave badly. Otherwise, you get like the magical Negro character, which is a character that always does the things that makes other characters feel good and never sort of like gets a sense of real complex humanity. And Alejandro, I thought about your story, Viernes Santo, because at the end the character does this thing that we don't want him to do. And I wonder, did you always know that's where it was going, or was it a struggle for you to put him in a place where he would do this thing that we don't want?
I didn't know that was what the character was going to do, and just spoiler alert, there's a friendship, a very strong bond between these two characters. One of them is leaving to the United States to play professional ball, and that character is faced with a choice at the end of the novel to basically leave his friend behind and getting beat up and going through this very nasty thing and escaping and kind of turning his back on his friend, or going and helping him. And he decides not to help him. He decides to leave. And I knew that at some point in the story there was going to have to be a choice that had to be made. I didn't really know what the outcome was going to be, but I think the idea that good people do bad things and bad people do good things is essential to fiction, because if somebody that's bad only does bad things, then it becomes a caricature. And same thing with good people, with the magical Negro figure that you mentioned and others. It becomes flat. So yeah, making your characters take difficult decisions, which not always will be the right ones, I think is extremely important.
Vevey, what about in nonfiction? You talked about Natalie, the woman from the essay about college debt, and wanting to sort of tell her story in a way that was true and accurate. But there's also, I suppose, the risk of turning a character into kind of a perpetual victim,
Right.
or turning them into an emblem of a problem as opposed to a person in a situation.
Yeah.
How do you avoid that?
I think that you avoid that with real detail. You avoid that by entering the conversation believing that somebody is more than a caricature or an emblem for an issue that they that might be part of their life. And it's interesting. I've been taking a photography class, and I was thinking about this earlier today and thinking about the panel that they talk some about documentary photographers who embed themselves in places and situations. And this has been in my mind because I talked about a photographer, Bruce Davidson. Some of you may know photography, and I may be speaking, I'm sort of speaking secondhand, but Bruce Davidson did a series in the late 1960s in Harlem where he embedded himself for a couple of years, and he went in with assumptions. I think we have to be careful of any assumptions that we go in with in any conversation that we're having when we want to write about people or really in life in general. But he went in with this assumption that he was probably going to be, taking photos of burned out buildings and all these other things. And what happened is once he embedded himself, people started coming to him and saying, will you take a picture of my family? Will you take a picture of it? And what he ended up creating was this series of people's like real lives inside their homes, in their families, cooking dinner, holding christenings, whatever those things were. And I think we all have really full human experiences, and we have to bring that same human experience to any time that we're writing about someone. And so I've lost the train of your question.
I have too. That was a great
Yeah.
answer. It was about
About
like how do you avoid turning
Yeah.
like somebody that you're telling their story as an anecdote
Right.
toward a point,
Right.
but how do you make them larger than the anecdote?
I think also you describe people based on, like, all of us have our little quirks, There's like a student that always wears a hat to class, and there's one that always carries her own salt shaker with her and puts her salt on at dinner, or there's one that calls her mother as soon as she gets out of class each night in Chicago to talk about what she learned. Like, there's all these ways that are not about what people's histories are or what brought them into that room or whatever. They're about who they are in the world. And I think we should always, as writers, be looking for those really individual details that help you see someone, and make them a unique person in the world and not an emblem of some issue that you think that they represent. So.
And I think you need to be flexible and have an opportunity to change your mind. In the work that I do, we do TV commercials for politicians, which doesn't sound very glamorous, but for example, in the Hillary for America campaign, we got the opportunity to go out in the country and speak to immigrants and women and people of color about their experience and what they did. And most of the time, we went in with assumptions of what we were going to get and what story we were going to tell. And the great majority of the time, that wasn't what we did, and that wasn't what we told. You have to pay tribute to the real story that you're being told and not massage it into what you want to say. So giving yourself that flexibility to explore and discover is extremely important in writing an op-ed and writing an essay and writing a piece of fiction. And a lot of the time it comes from talking to the people that have lived through these experiences and letting that change you and change your mind.
Was that difficult, to go out and interview people, knowing that you're going to use their stories in TV commercials, especially because, and we've all heard politicians do this. They say, "I was just in Florida the other day, and I talked to this young woman, and she told me," and then at a certain point, the story starts to feel canned, and like you wonder, is that a real person, or did you just sort of like invent that story to like support your point? How? Because politics and political advertising does, as much of any speech like has a point that it's trying to to make. Like, was it difficult to give yourself the freedom to say, well, maybe we're going to tell a different story than what we expected?
It is hard, and sometimes it's not only hard; it's impossible to tell the story you wanna tell. Sometimes the political machine constrains your ability to tell the real story, and you have to kind of fall into that canned message because that's how a political campaign works. But we succeeded, I think, a few times in telling really powerful stories, and the way that, at least I think we did it, was we let the people tell the story. We got as far away as we could from the material and let the material speak for itself. And in my view, those were the pieces that were more successful in the end, when politics sort of sat down and, the real immigrant story sort of shined through.
Vevey, I want to talk about op-eds a bit, because so you've written an op-ed or op-eds, and you were part of the op-ed project, which Well, first, tell us a bit about the op-ed project and
Yeah,
what it is.
so those of you who are interested in op-eds, there's a fantastic nonprofit called the Op-Ed Project. I think it's out of Washington, D.C., but they do periodic workshops in Austin and around the country, and I was able to go through a training with them a couple of years ago that was really pretty life-changing. And their focus is on the voices that are not represented in our mainstream media. 80-something% of op-eds are written by men, probably mostly by white men. Women aren't submitting at the same level as men, so it's not just that the publications are selecting men, it's that women are actually not putting their voice out there. They have a lot of, this is when I began by sort of saying, what expertise do you have? This is a lot of what they emphasize, is like claiming what you already know so that you can bring it into the conversation. But I did that training, worked on some op-eds, and then I've been doing training since the election with groups that are interested in sort of having their voice be part of that conversation. So, yeah.
So what is the generally, like, what is the process if people want to write op-eds? Like, how does one go about it? I mean, because like with like short stories, you submit to journals, and there's a long process. Poetry is the same way. Novels, you go through agents or like editors. Like, what is the process for an op-ed?
So an op-ed should be connected to something that's in the news, to some kind of news item. So that's really like the place to begin is, though they sort of trained us that, sometimes that can be a seasonal. Most of us probably a week ago could have written an op-ed about something completely far-flung that we could have connected to Valentine's Day, right? So you need a lead that will connect you, but you really want to be connecting to something that's in the news. You want to be not just sort of meditating on a subject, but actually spelling out an argument. This is the outcome that I want to see. These are the arguments and the evidence that support that. Here's the other side of it, and here's what I want you to do. So op-eds are really geared, in part towards policymakers and decision makers, and that's who you want to be thinking about, and like, what outcome do I want somebody to take from having read this op-ed? And they're short, they're 600 to 800 words. You probably want to write them quickly. The newspapers are really great about having response time. So if you're writing for a literary journal, you can send your short story there, and you may not hear from them for 14 months or any other amount of time. They'll tell you, the New York Times says, if you don't hear from us in 3 business days, assume we're not taking it and continue on. Washington Post says 7. So they're moving pretty quickly through those. If you're interested in writing op-eds, I definitely suggest that you look at the op-ed project, which you can Google that, and they have a great page about submitting with about 50 different outlets, what their submission guidelines are, et cetera. So you're writing in response to something in the news, you're writing relatively quickly, you're writing with a sense of your own authority and with an argument for what you want to see the outcome, and you're getting it off fast.
And you mentioned, the sort of writing it for policymakers. Do you have a particular audience in mind for an op-ed, or is it more general? Like, do you think about who you're writing it for?
I tended to think about policymakers in the work that I was doing, though I will tell you that one of the great things about writing an op-ed and getting it published is that it brings you into the conversation around the issue that you're invested in. And so in the op-ed that I wrote, then I had a registrar at the University of Michigan contacting me about what they do at the University of Michigan who's concerned about the same issue. I had, brings you into this larger conversation. So I was thinking about the people that could make changes in policies, but I was actually making space. I was contacted by a number of people during that time to talk to other people who also wanted to advocate around that issue. So,
in addition to being an op-ed writer, you're also a poet. And Nam was talking about how didacticism can kill like a story. And you would think that would be true of poetry. And I remember in college reading some like Marxist poetry that was pretty bad. But like lots of poets have strong messages. I mean,
Yes.
Amiri Baraka, Gwendolyn Brooks, Etheridge Knight, Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde, Walt Whitman, et cetera. I mean, these were poets who were writing with Reginald Betts, with like very clear like points that they want, not necessarily like a takeaway for policymakers, but you don't leave the poem wondering what they think about it.
Right.
And so I wonder, as a poet and an op-ed writer, how do you know which form you're going to write it? Are there things which are like, well, like that's more suited for an op-ed, that's more suited for a poem? Are you ever not sure?
I think I'm never not sure. I can imagine how you might be not sure, but I feel like my creative or expressive impulse sort of lands in different places. And so for me personally, when I'm writing poetry, I feel like I'm more, I'm interested in a moment, I'm interested in rendering something lyric, I'm interested in description and image, and when I'm working on an essay, I'm interested in that idea of the essay, the questioning and attempting to understand something. And when I'm writing an op-ed, I'm really thinking more about like data and facts and outcomes. So for me, personally, they feel very separate. Though I think you're right. There's political poetry both in this country and elsewhere that has been really powerful and transformative for people. So,
Alejandro, what about, because you've written essays and short stories, you're working on a novel, and they cover, like they sort of overlap in ways. Do you ever find yourself sort of writing fiction, but like veering into essay, and then you say, well, I've got to sort of like pull that out and make it its own thing? Or do they sort of start out separate in your mind?
No, they start mixed all the time, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think fiction sometimes benefits from essay-style writing in a way. I actually love it when that sort of voice comes into fiction a little bit. If I can imbue the essay voice into one of my characters, I'm usually pretty happy in how that page looks. But it is complicated to decide. You sort of sit down and write, and you decide as you do it. I've had cases where I'm writing something for my novel, and I take that page and I say, well, I'm going to transform this into an essay. I'm going to tweak it and change it and turn it into something else. So I think it feeds, fiction and nonfiction kind of feeds from each other. The other thing that I've noticed a lot is it's great when you're stuck in one type of writing to jump to a different style of writing. It sort of, shakes your gears a little bit and shakes the rust off and kind of lets you focus in a different way. And it's beneficial both ways, I think.
Nan, you joked earlier that you have an audience of 10 people in literary fiction. But I wonder if you think about audience at all in terms of crafting a scene or a chapter or how a character sort of is described. Do you think about how it will be received by the reader, and particular readers from different backgrounds or viewpoints or whatever?
I do, and I recommend that to my students as well. Let me first mention them. A large percentage of the student population in my university is Hispanic. So in my fiction writing workshops, quite a few of them will blend Spanish and English. And they, like everything, they differ in the way they handle it, as it should be, because they have different styles, different personalities, different stories to tell. But we always come back to the question, if you're going to include what some people will think is a foreign language, how are you going to handle that? And you need to know going in, there's a chance you might lose some readers. How do you feel about that? Who is your audience? So we talk about it a lot. For myself, this is interesting. It's hard. I can't give a completely honest answer to this because the novel I'm working on now is so different from the first novel. And I think the audience will be very different, but I am not sure because it's not finished. So it's still in process, and who knows what it'll be. I think it might have a wider readership. God, please, from my lips to God's ear.
I guess, so one last question, and then I want to turn it over to the audience for a couple of questions. But, if we're writing about social justice and writing about characters who are unlike you, and whose experiences are different from yours. Like one of the issues that has come up lately, there's been a kind of like large conversation about it, is like the idea of cultural appropriation. Idea of like telling somebody's story. It's not your story, it's their story. And the question of like, can anybody tell any story, or are some stories sort of reserved or better told by certain people? And I'm curious where y'all fall on that. Is cultural appropriation like what we identify when it's been done badly, when people have told the story badly, or like are some stories impossible to tell well unless you have certain experiences? I'll open that one up. See if
I'll start with it.
Okay.
I think it's an extremely kind of thin line to walk on. And it's true what you said. You can tell when they've done it badly, and it's very apparent. But when you read, and this is something I was listening to the New Yorker Fiction podcast not too long ago, and David Means was reading a piece by Sherman Alexie. And one of the things that struck me that he said was that a story or a piece of literature can implicate you into a culture. It can actually make you become, at least temporarily, something you are not. And that, I think, plays double for the person that's writing it. I mean, if you are writing something that's not yours, you have to really be responsible for telling the story the way that it is, because you're in a way implicating yourself into that culture. And if you don't do it right, you're going to piss off a lot of people, and rightfully so. So with great power comes great responsibility, as Uncle Ben once said. And, if you're writing something, you have to take ownership of it and be responsible for the outcome. So it's a fine line to walk.
I'll add, that's such a sticky question, and there have been really great answers to it. The one thing I'll add is that I think, we can think about our own writing, and we can also think about how we help other people tell their stories. And I think that we can do that by trying to help them render those stories. We can also do that by helping empower them to tell those stories. And I think because I'm a writing teacher, that's really important to me. But I think if you're concerned about that, I was in a meeting earlier this week with somebody at the mayor's office. I'm part of a group of women writer activists, and they said to us, like, the most important thing that you could do is go out and help people tell their stories. The people that don't necessarily have the skill set or the agency or feel like they have the voice, help them tell their stories. And so I think that's a way of if your real intention is about helping somebody else's story come into the world and doing it in whatever way is necessary, then you might get past some of that appropriation, because it's really not about you, it's about that story.
Open it up briefly to the audience. Are there questions that you all have? I think we have time for a couple.
How do you decide what or how much of your controversial work to share with people in your life who don't agree with you?
All of it.
You share all of it?
I especially show it to people who might disagree with it.
I think it's extremely important to share that work, and even if it's not your own work, books that speak to subjects that they might not agree with. Michael has a great initiative called Books Are Not a Luxury, where he highlights sort of great new pieces of fiction written by either people of color or LGBT writers or people with disabilities. And I think it's our responsibility to share those pieces of work with people that might not agree with it. Maybe it's not my work, but it's something else that speaks to that, and sharing that is extremely important, I think.
I was making reference to getting feedback. Is that what you were thinking about? Showing something that you're in progress of writing, in the process of writing, and then?
Just your opinions in general.
I would like to have the feedback of someone who would have a different perspective. Because I've already explained, I'm trying to give the full range of ideas, right? So I would like to hear what the other person is thinking. I would definitely seek that out.
I think your question speaks to the risk. We can speak a lot about, feeling galvanized and wanting to get voices out there, but there's also a risk. We're in a tremendously divided culture. We're divided within our own communities, and, and I think you have to be prepared for that if you're going to write about social justice. You have to be prepared to expect there to be, people that don't agree with you or people that can very volubly don't agree with you. And there's not a good answer for that. It's sort of, you know that you're stepping into that, or you choose not to step in, but it's very much the flip side of this whole conversation, is what it means to kind of put yourself and your voice and your name out there in a very vitriolic time and place,
And there's a reason they tell you not to read the comments on your op-ed, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and I started, and then I was like, oh, no, I can't do that.
How receptive are small-town newspapers to op-eds?
I'm glad you asked that. I don't know the answer to that, but in that same meeting at the mayor's office, the person that we met with said, your group wants to be writing op-eds and not publishing them in the Statesman, but publishing them in Belton or Temple or, name your place. So that just happened a couple of days ago, and that's been in my head. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a great question to have out there, because I think, again, she called us the blueberry and the tomato soup, and it's really great to get voices out there in that way. But if you're wanting to change minds, I think you got to be thinking about what the outlets are that might be able to do that. But the answer is I don't know.
Please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Writers League of Texas Third Thursday podcast. For more information about this program or the Writers League of Texas, please visit our website at writersleague.org, email us at wlt@writersleague.org, or give us a call at 512-499-8914.